You already sense it, not because someone taught you, not because you read a book, but because somewhere in your gut, you've always known when something about a person didn't match, when their voice said one thing, but their posture whispered something else entirely. It's not magic, it's not intuition, it's pattern recognition. But no one ever taught you the language. From the moment we're born, we're told to listen to words, to trust what's said, not what's shown. But language was never meant to reveal the truth. It was built to survive, to adapt, to protect. And that's why most people, they don't lie to you on purpose. They lie out of reflex, because the lie is safer than being seen. Nietzsche understood this before psychology ever caught up. He said every deep soul wears a mask, not as deception, but as necessity. Because the world doesn't reward honesty, it rewards palatability. And so, to avoid rejection, people become performances. But here's the thing they never tell you. Every performance has cracks, every mask leaks. And once you learn to see it, not just hear it, you'll never be fooled again. This isn't a checklist. This is a decoding system for human behavior, not to manipulate, but to understand. Let's start with the most important truth. Everyone wears a mask, not because they're fake, but because being real once got them hurt. You can't grow up in this world without adapting. Maybe you learned to be funny so no one saw your sadness. Maybe you learned to be quiet because speaking got you in trouble. Maybe you became the helper so you wouldn't be left behind. Whatever it was, it worked, at least for a while. But masks aren't identities, they're shields. And over time, even the person wearing it forgets what they were covering. So when someone seems too kind, too accommodating, too perfect, don't assume it's real. Watch for the tension. Do their words move easily, or do they stumble? Do their eyes dart when the topic gets close to home? Do they change the subject just as something real begins to surface? That's your first signal, because truth doesn't flinch. Performance does. Now, let's go deeper. What someone criticizes the most reveals what they're hiding in themselves. Nietzsche saw this clearly. Projection isn't just a defense mechanism, it's a confession. The man who can't stop mocking weakness, he's terrified of being seen as fragile. The woman who constantly calls out dishonesty, she's likely lying to herself daily. The friend who gossips about arrogance, they're wrestling with their own hidden insecurities. When you hear someone fixate on a flaw in others, don't focus on the target, focus on the intensity. What are they trying so hard not to admit? Because the truth is, we hate in others what we fear in ourselves, and that makes criticism a mirror. Here's another lens. Silence is more honest than speech. Words are rehearsed, taught, recycled, but silence is real. You'll learn more from a pause than a paragraph. When someone goes quiet after a question, when they offer short robotic answers to something deeply personal, when they suddenly seem distracted or change the topic when you hit a nerve, that's not avoidance, that's revelation. People think they're hiding the truth with silence, but they're actually highlighting where it lives. Because avoidance is directional. It points exactly to the place someone doesn't want you to look. Now listen to this closely. Excessive morality is often disguised ego. Be wary of the ones who can't stop preaching, the ones obsessed with doing the right thing, who love correcting others, who always seem to have a moral lesson ready. Nietzsche called this the will to power, dressed up in virtue. It's not about goodness, it's about control. Because the person who needs to be seen as righteous often isn't trying to be good, they're trying to feel superior. Real integrity is quiet. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't need to win the moral argument. It just is. So when someone makes their morality loud, ask what they're afraid of being without it. And that leads to the most haunting truth of all. Before people lie to you, they lie to themselves. You've heard it before. I'm fine. I don't care anymore. That doesn't bother me. But it does. And they know it. Somewhere, beneath the armor and excuses, they know. But self-deception is survival. It's easier to believe you've moved on than to admit you're still bleeding. It's easier to say it's nothing than to confront the truth that still wakes you up at 3 a.m. And when someone lies that way, don't take it personally. See it for what it is, an old story that got them through the storm. But the cracks will show, in their tone, in their body language, in the inconsistencies. And if you're watching closely, you'll read them long before they speak. Last one for now. Superiority is a mask for deep insecurity. The loudest person in the room, the one who always has the answer, always needs to win, always reminds you of how accomplished they are, is almost always hiding something. Because real confidence is calm. It doesn't interrupt. It doesn't dominate. It doesn't need a spotlight. So when someone constantly performs power, look behind the curtain. What are they afraid of losing? What part of themselves do they fear isn't enough? The answer to that question will tell you everything. But let me be clear, this isn't about judging people. It's about understanding them. When you learn to see the fear behind the arrogance, the wound behind the control, the silence behind the smile, you don't become cynical, you become wise. You stop reacting and you start seeing. So take this knowledge and use it gently, because the point isn't to expose people, it's to connect with them, beneath the roles they were forced to play. And if this first part helped you decode what's behind the mask, stick with me. In the next part, we'll dive even deeper, into the exact places where the mask begins to break, where the truth starts leaking through, and you can finally see someone clearly, even if they have spent their whole life hiding. This is just the beginning. Now that you've started to see the mask, let's talk about when it slips. Because no matter how polished someone appears, no matter how airtight their image feels, it only takes one moment, one flicker of discomfort, one question too close to the wound, 1 second of silence that lasts just a bit too long. That's when you catch it, the real self peeking through the seams. And once you learn to watch for these exact moments, not just the big ones, but the subtle ones, people become an open book. So let's keep decoding. Here's the first truth in this deeper layer. Most behavior is not a choice. It's a reaction to fear. Why does someone overshare with strangers? Why do they always have to be in control of the plan? Why do they ghost when things start to feel real? Because fear doesn't ask for permission. It drives the wheel. Fear of being left, fear of being wrong, fear of being vulnerable. And most of all, fear of being seen and still not being loved. So the next time someone acts out of character, pause. Don't ask, why are they like this? Ask, what are they afraid will happen if they're not? Because underneath the behavior is the wound. Here's another lens. What people mock most loudly is what they secretly wrestle with. Think about that friend who jokes constantly about needy people. They might be starving for affection, but too scared to ask for it. The guy who constantly mocks therapy, he probably has a mountain of pain he's terrified to unpack. The woman who ridicules people for being too sensitive, she likely wasn't allowed to feel growing up. We use sarcasm and mockery as shields, but they're see-through if you know what to look for. So, when you hear someone go on and on, tearing down a certain kind of person, ask yourself, what part of themselves are they trying to exile? Because the things we push away in others are often the parts we've been punished for in ourselves. Now look at this one. Confidence is often just guilt, dressed in designer clothes. You've seen them, the ones who have it all together, always organized, always decisive, always 5 steps ahead. But look closely, not at what they do, but how they do it. Is there tension in their voice when they're in control? Do they shut down when things don't go according to plan? Do they explain a little too much when no one asked? That's not clarity, that's compensation. Because real peace is quiet. It doesn't sprint. It doesn't prove. It doesn't dominate the room. But guilt performs. Guilt works overtime trying to become worthy again. And sometimes, people aren't performing strength. They're apologizing for their past, without ever saying a word. Another dead giveaway. When someone speaks in absolutes, they're drowning in doubt. You know the lines. I don't need anyone. I'm always happy. I never get angry. I've moved on. No one always anything. When someone's language is that airtight, it's not because they're stable, it's because they're fragile. They're clinging to a narrative that keeps them from falling apart. So the louder someone insists on their identity, the more likely it's a patch, not a truth. And here's the pattern. The more extreme the statement, the more fear lives underneath it. That brings us to control. Those who need to control everything usually feel powerless inside. This is one of the clearest tells, and one of the easiest to miss. It's not just the micromanager boss or the partner who plans every second of the vacation. It's the person who can't stand surprises, the one who needs constant updates, the one who panics when someone doesn't respond right away. It's not that they don't trust you, it's that they don't trust life. Because somewhere deep inside, they believe that if they don't tighten every bolt, everything will collapse. So when you meet someone obsessed with control, don't confuse it with strength. It's usually a survival strategy for someone who once had none. And finally, this one may be the most haunting of all. The louder the performance, the emptier the core. We live in a world of curated identities, perfect vacations, filtered photos, daily updates meant to say, "Look at me, I matter." But underneath most of that noise is a silent belief. I'm only valuable if I'm seen. You see it in the constant selfies, the subtle bragging disguised as inspiration, the need to be liked by everyone, even strangers. It's not narcissism. It's a fear of vanishing, of being invisible, of not existing in anyone's mind, unless you make them look. But a person who is whole inside, they don't need the spotlight. They're not allergic to silence. They don't need to prove every day that they're okay. They just are. And that's what makes these patterns so powerful. Once you know how to see them, you stop believing the act. You start seeing the ache. But I'll say it again. This is not about judgment. This is about grace. Because when you recognize that most people are acting out their pain, you stop reacting with confusion and start responding with understanding. You begin to see that behind the loudest laughter is often loneliness. Behind the harshest judgments is usually shame. And behind the obsession with control is often a heart that's never felt safe. So, if you've made it this far, something in you is shifting. You don't just hear people anymore, you read them. And in part 3, we go further. We'll strip away the final defenses, the childhood stories that keep people stuck, the invisible rules that control their relationships, and the way envy, silence, and overcompensation reveal more than a confession ever could. Because reading people isn't a tactic, it's a kind of awakening. And once you see it, you won't look at the world the same again. If you've made it this far, you already know. People aren't random, they're patterned. And those patterns, they didn't start last week. They started decades ago, when their voice first got silenced, when their feelings first got punished, when love became something they had to earn. Most people aren't acting from personality, they're acting from programming. So, if you really want to read someone, don't ask, what kind of person are they? Ask, what kind of child were they trained to be? Because that's the root of it all. Let's begin with this brutal truth. People don't speak from logic, they speak from pain. You've seen it. The person who says, "I don't believe in love, it's just chemicals." The one who tells you, "People always leave, you can't trust anyone." The one who lives by, "Success matters more than happiness." At first glance, they sound logical, reasonable, even confident. But listen again. Beneath the sentence is a scar. What they're really saying is, "I loved once and got shattered. I trusted and was betrayed. I smiled and no one noticed." What sounds like philosophy is often just protection. And that changes everything. Because once you stop reacting to the words, you can start hearing the wound. The next key is this. How someone responds to weakness reveals their true power. Want to know who someone really is? Don't watch how they treat people they admire. Watch how they treat someone who can't fight back. Do they mock? Do they roll their eyes? Do they need to dominate the conversation? That's not strength. That's still a child who had to be perfect to be loved, now punishing others for showing the softness they were never allowed to have. But the ones who sit with pain and don't flinch, the ones who forgive instead of humiliate, the ones who give grace when they could demand revenge, those are the real warriors, because they've already faced the war inside, and won. Here's another layer most people never see. The person who craves attention is afraid of being forgotten. We love to label them attention seeker, drama queen, narcissist, but step back. Why does someone need to be the loudest voice in the room? Why do they change personalities depending on who's watching? Why is silence so unbearable to them? Because there's a deeper ache. They were probably the kid who was left alone too long, the one who got praised only when they achieved something, the one whose feelings were overlooked unless they made a scene. So now, they seek applause, not because they're vain, but because they are terrified that without the noise, no one will see them at all. And when you look at it that way, you stop rolling your eyes. You start seeing the child, still performing, still waiting to be seen. Which leads to this one. The person they attack is often the person they secretly envy. It's easier to hate someone than to admit you want what they have. The confident one, the free one, the person who walks without shame, speaks without fear, lives without apology. We've all felt it. that sting of seeing someone be what we've been punished for. So instead of reaching toward that freedom, we tear it down. That's not cruelty, that's despair. Because when someone criticizes another person relentlessly, it's often because they see a version of themselves they gave up on. And what they can't embody, they try to destroy. But if you can see that, truly see it, you become immune to the noise. You stop defending yourself against people who are actually mourning themselves. Here's another one most people never consider. People don't act from beliefs. They act from rehearsals. That woman who always apologizes before speaking, she probably learned early that her voice was too much. That man who shuts down in every argument, he was likely punished as a boy for showing emotion. That overachiever who never stops moving, he might have had to earn love with results, not presence. We think people are complex, but often they're just repeating scenes they were forced to learn. Not because they believe in them, but because they survived them. So, if you want to understand someone, ask, what did they have to become to feel safe? Because most adult behavior is just a child's survival script, still running. And once you spot it, you'll never unsee it. Now, here's the final and most subtle key of this layer. People confess their wounds through their patterns, not their words, not their stories, their habits. That friend who disappears when things get emotionally intense, she's not flaky. She's scared of intimacy. That guy who constantly jokes, even during serious conversations, he's not immature. He's afraid of being taken seriously and rejected. That person who dates everyone but never connects with anyone, they're not careless. They're terrified of being truly known and heard again. Most people don't know how to say, I'm still healing, so they show you. Every silence, every overreaction, every withdrawal, it's a message. But here's the tragedy, because no one ever taught us how to read it. We take it personally. We get angry. We shut down. We mirror the very thing they're trying to hide. But if you can read the pattern without reacting, you give someone the rarest thing in the world, to be seen without being punished. That's what Nietzsche meant when he said, there are no facts, only interpretations. It's not that truth doesn't exist, it's that most people are speaking in code, and when you learn to translate it, you don't become manipulative, you become deeply human. So, take a breath, let everything we've uncovered sink in, because in the final chapter, we go all the way down. You'll learn to see the beliefs that were never theirs, the rules they never questioned, the invisible wounds they carry into every room, every relationship, every decision. And once you can see that, you won't just read people. You'll remember who you were before the mask, too. There's a moment, and if you're honest, you felt it, when someone says something that sounds completely logical, but something inside you tenses. You can't explain why. The words check out, the tone is calm, but it feels off, like they're not talking to you. They're defending themselves. That's not paranoia, that's intuition. Because here's the next truth. No one speaks from pure logic. They speak from the pain they have survived. A person doesn't say, you should never depend on anyone, because they read it in a book. They say it because someone they depended on shattered them. They don't say, feelings make you weak, because it's an original thought. They say it because, as a child, expressing emotion made them unsafe. People form beliefs not from wisdom, but from wounds, and then they build their worldview around avoiding that pain again. The tragedy, they think they're being objective. They call it being realistic. They think it's truth, but it's not truth. It's armor. So, when someone argues with conviction, when they defend a belief with too much intensity, pause. Instead of asking, what do they believe? Ask, what hurt are they protecting? Now you're reading them correctly. Here's another reveal. How someone responds to weakness exposes their emotional age, not their calendar age, not their career title, their emotional maturity. Because it's easy to be nice to the people you admire, to those you want something from. But when someone has nothing to offer, when they're messy, vulnerable, inconvenient, that's when your truth shows up. Watch carefully. Do they get annoyed by someone who cries? Do they ridicule the awkward or the slow? Do they weaponize their intellect to feel above others? Then you're not looking at a strong person. You're looking at someone still ruled by the child who wasn't allowed to be messy. Real power doesn't flinch at weakness. It sits with it. It listens. It doesn't need to dominate, because it's already at peace. Here's one of the most invisible wounds people carry: the fear of being forgotten. You see it in the loud ones, the oversharers. The people who need to be tagged, praised, remembered, seen. It's easy to judge them as needy or narcissistic. But dig deeper. Why the need to be remembered? Why the obsession with legacy? Why the panic when attention fades? Because somewhere in their history, they were forgotten, passed over, ignored, left behind. Maybe not physically, but emotionally. And that ache, it doesn't go away on its own. So it shows up in overperformance, in grand gestures, in the fear that if they're not spectacular, they're invisible. The next layer is the one most people lie to themselves about. People often attack who they secretly wish they could become. Think about it. Who do people mock online? The bold, the happy, the ones who speak freely. Why? Because they represent a freedom the critic hasn't claimed yet. Nietzsche saw this clearly. He called it ressentiment, a special kind of bitterness. It doesn't just hate power, it hates what it can't access. So someone sees you laugh too loudly, dress too freely, succeed too unapologetically, and it triggers their own disowned self. They could say, I admire that, but that would require humility. So they criticize. But don't be fooled. Behind every targeted judgment is a hidden desire. I want that too. I just don't believe I'm allowed to have it. And when you see this, not just in others but in yourself, you begin to release shame. Because even your envy is telling you something honest. Now here's where we move from outer behavior to inner blueprint. Most people don't act from beliefs. They act from childhood. Look around. The man who never stops working, raised to believe rest is laziness. The woman who never says no, trained to earn love through obedience. The friend who disappears when you get too close, learned that intimacy meant pain. They don't even know they're doing it. They call it just how I am. But it's not personality, it's programming. We repeat what we survived. We reenact what felt familiar, even if it hurts. That's why change is so hard. It's not just breaking habits. It's breaking loyalty to the version of ourselves that kept us safe when we had no choice. So next time someone behaves in a way that confuses or disappoints you, ask, who did they have to be to survive? That question alone will give you more insight than years of surface-level analysis. And now, the final truth of this layer, patterns are confessions. You don't need someone to tell you what hurts them. They already are. In the way they talk over people, in the way they avoid eye contact, in the way they fall in love too fast, or refuse to love at all. It's all a message. But because we're never taught how to listen, we miss it. We take it personally. We react instead of understand. But when you learn to see the pattern for what it is, a signal, not a threat, you start giving people something rare. Understanding without judgment, connection without control, grace without performance. That's the difference between manipulation and mastery. Nietzsche didn't teach us to see people so we could control them. He taught us so we could stop being confused by them, so we could stop projecting our wounds onto theirs, so we could start relating as humans, not as performances in conflict. And most of all, so we could begin to read ourselves, because what you see in others is just a reflection of what you've buried too. Take a breath. You're almost there. In the final chapter, we step beyond analysis, beyond defense, into something sacred. You'll learn how to recognize the original wound behind every behavior, and more importantly, how to respond in a way that rewrites the script for both of you. You've spent your life decoding others. Now you're going to remember who you were before you were taught to hide. By now, you don't just see people differently, you feel them differently. You walk into a room and the energy speaks before the words do. You're no longer distracted by volume or performance or charm. You listen beneath the surface. You watch for what isn't said. And you understand that people aren't confusing. They're just scared. And their behavior is the language of that fear. But now comes the part no one warns you about. Once you see people clearly, you begin to see yourself more clearly too. And that clarity, it doesn't always feel like peace at first. It feels like grief, because you realize something heavy. You weren't reading them wrong. You were reading them through your own mask. That friend you thought rejected you, maybe you never let them close. That partner who never made you feel safe, maybe you were repeating what felt familiar from childhood. That enemy you kept fighting in others, maybe it was a version of yourself you hadn't forgiven yet. This is the final truth, the deepest one Nietzsche hinted at. Every time you try to read someone else, you are unconsciously remembering a version of you. That's why you're so drawn to some people, why you're triggered by others, why you fall for patterns that hurt, why may you run from peace and call it boring. You're not reacting to them, you're reacting to the script. The unspoken rulebook written long ago, when you were too small to know you were learning the wrong lesson. You thought love had to be earned, that safety came from control, that visibility required perfection, that asking for your needs made you a burden. And without realizing it, you spent years finding people who mirrored those early truths, not because they were right, but because they were familiar. But here's where your power begins. Because once you know this, you can rewrite the pattern. You stop needing others to validate your worth. You stop chasing unavailable people hoping they'll choose you. You stop proving, performing, pretending. Because you understand, everything you tried to get from them was something you needed to give to yourself. That's what Nietzsche meant by becoming who you are. It's not about becoming more, it's about remembering who you were before the world taught you to be less, before the mask, before the guilt, before the role you never chose but mastered to survive. So, how do you do that? How do you become someone who sees clearly and still loves deeply? Here's where theory becomes transformation. You pause before reacting. You don't absorb someone's chaos and call it your responsibility. You ask better questions, not, why are they doing this to me? But, what story are they reliving through me? You set boundaries without guilt, because now you know, protecting your peace is not cruelty, it's clarity. You listen to the pattern, not just the apology, because someone's behavior after they say sorry is more honest than the apology itself. You forgive, but not to forget. You forgive to free yourself from the contract of carrying their wound. And most importantly, you give yourself the grace you've given everyone else. Because if you can decode a stranger's mask, you can learn to remove your own. And that is the highest act of self-respect. To stop hiding, not just from the world, but from yourself. You stop saying, I'm fine, when you're breaking. You stop laughing when something hurts. You stop shrinking to fit someone else's comfort zone. You speak, you stand, you stay honest, even if your voice shakes. And that's where everything changes. Because the person who sees clearly, not just others, but themselves, becomes unshakable, not cold, not distant, not manipulative, but sovereign, compassionate, alive. That's who you've always been, underneath the training, underneath the expectations, underneath the 1,000 masks. You were never meant to be a chameleon. You were meant to be a mirror, a reflection that reminds others. It's okay to drop the act. It's safe to be real. It's possible to be seen and still be loved. So here's what I'll leave you with. The next time you feel yourself reacting, pause, look closer, ask, what are they afraid of? And then ask, what am I afraid of? Because that's where the truth lives. Not in the story, not in the noise, but in the wound. And the more honestly you see it, the more power you reclaim. You're not broken, you're just remembering. And from here forward, every time you feel triggered, every time someone tests your peace, every time you want to fall back into your mask, you'll know you're being invited back to yourself, back to the version of you that doesn't need to be read, because they are no longer hiding.